The collar was sitting a fraction too high against my neck. I adjusted it with 2 fingers and checked the alignment in the restroom mirror again. The marble walls of the Mayflower Hotel reflected every bright light overhead, making the gold trim on my army mess dress uniform look almost too sharp. The air smelled like brass polish and the kind of floral hand soap hotels bought in industrial quantities. Somebody had left a paper towel crumpled beside the sink. My phone vibrated against the cold granite counter. I glanced down. Derek, investors are here. Stay in the back and don't make your little army job sound too depressing. That was it. No did you find parking? No glad you made it. No how've you been? Just instructions. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. My brother had been talking to me like that for years. The funny part was that he genuinely believed he was being helpful. Derek sold military equipment for a company called Ironcrest Defense Systems. According to Derek, he was personally responsible for modernizing national security, strengthening strategic partnerships, and probably keeping the moon in orbit. According to reality, he was a salesman. A very successful salesman, but still a salesman. I straightened the gold braiding on my sleeve and checked one last detail. The bronze star sat exactly where it belonged. The ribbons were aligned. The brass buttons were polished. Nothing needed fixing. I opened the restroom door. The noise hit me immediately. Hundreds of conversations crashed together beneath crystal chandeliers. Glasses clinked. Laughter bounced off the ballroom walls. Somewhere near the stage, a string quartet was trying its best to compete, with 400 wealthy people discussing money. Good luck with that. As I stepped inside and moved along the perimeter of the room, years in military intelligence had taught me something useful. People revealed more when they thought nobody important was listening. Defense contractors were especially generous. One executive near the bar was explaining supply chain resilience to a woman who clearly wanted another drink. Another was describing a future battlefield system using so many buzzwords that I wasn't sure he understood his own sentence. Adaptive, integrated, multi-domain, transformational. The man deserved a bingo card. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. It was already losing its bubbles. Across the ballroom, Derek stood in the center of a crowd wearing a charcoal tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He had one hand wrapped around a drink and the other moving constantly as he talked. People laughed whenever he paused. Not because he was funny, because he was valuable. There was a difference. I watched him point toward a display of armored vehicle models positioned beside a giant banner for Ironcrest Defense Systems. He looked comfortable there, like a man who had spent years practicing how to belong in expensive rooms. Valerie. I didn't need to turn around. Only one person in the world could make my name sound like an item that had arrived damaged. My mother stepped beside me. Sylvia Thorne looked flawless. Her silver necklace matched her evening gown perfectly. Her smile was polished enough to survive international travel. The first thing she did was adjust my sleeve. Not hug me, not say hello, the sleeve. You could have worn something simpler, she said. This is a business event. I looked down at my uniform. This is the formal military dress code, still. That was her favorite argument, still. My father joined us a second later carrying a glass of bourbon that smelled expensive. Derek says tonight is important, he said. $40 million logistics contract. I nodded. I heard. Try not to pull focus. There it was, the family tradition. Derek achieved. Everyone else adjusted accordingly. I took a sip of sparkling water. I wasn't planning a musical number. Dad laughed. Mom didn't. Neither of them seemed to realize I was joking. That wasn't new either. Across the ballroom, Derek finally noticed us. His smile widened immediately. Not the family smile, the presentation smile. The one he used when there was an audience. He started walking toward us, and I noticed another man beside him. Mid-50s. Tailored tuxedo. The kind of posture that came from signing paychecks large enough to change lives. Richard Vance. Ironcrest CEO. Derek was bringing him directly toward us. Mom instantly straightened her posture. Dad set down his drink. I almost laughed. The transformation was impressive. 3 seconds earlier, I had been the potential embarrassment. Now a CEO was approaching. Suddenly, everyone was on their best behavior. Derek stopped in front of us. Richard, this is my family. Vance shook my father's hand first, then my mother's. Then he looked at me. His eyes paused briefly on the dark blue uniform, then on the ribbons, then on the metal above my pocket. The ice inside someone's nearby glass clinked softly. Derek's grin got wider, a little too wide. The kind of smile people wear right before they say something they think is clever. And judging by the look on his face, my brother was about to put on a show. Have you ever worked harder than everyone in the room, only to be treated like you didn't belong there? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, family, and the moment truth finally catches up with arrogance, remember our exclusive stories premiere every day at 12:30 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. I'd love to see you at the next one. The smile on Derek's face always got bigger when someone important was watching. I could see it from 20 feet away. Richard Vance stood beside him with the relaxed confidence of a man whose signature could make people rich or unemployed before lunch. Derek was talking with his hands again, guiding him through the room as if he personally owned the hotel. Maybe in his head he did. I took another sip of sparkling water. It had gone flat. Across the ballroom, the defense industry was busy congratulating itself. Men in tailored tuxedos exchanged business cards like poker chips. Women in designer gowns smiled through conversations about procurement schedules and acquisition forecasts. Every few minutes, somebody mentioned national security, and every few minutes, somebody else mentioned quarterly growth. Funny how often those two subjects ended up in the same sentence. The string quartet near the stage shifted into another piece. Nobody seemed to notice. They were too busy performing for each other. I moved toward the edge of the ballroom, away from the crowd gathered around Derek. Years in intelligence had taught me that standing quietly near a wall revealed more than standing in the middle of a conversation. People forgot you were there. A defense consultant with a silver watch worth more than my monthly mortgage. Payment was explaining battlefield realities to another executive. The problem was that I recognized every military term he used, and half of them were wrong. He spoke confidently anyway. That seemed to be enough. Near the center of the room, Derek threw his head back and laughed at something Richard Vance said. Several executives joined in a second later, a synchronous reaction. Nobody wanted to risk missing the cue. I almost admired the efficiency. Almost. Valerie. My mother's voice appeared beside me again. I turned. Sylvia was carrying a champagne flute she hadn't touched in at least 15 minutes. Her attention wasn't on the ballroom, it was on me, specifically my uniform. Her eyes moved across the sleeves, the ribbons, the medals. Then she clicked her tongue. There it was. The sound she made whenever she found something that needed correcting. She reached up before I could stop her and smoothed a section of fabric that didn't need smoothing. You always stand so stiff. I'm in uniform, you know what I mean? Not really. But I knew better than to ask. My father joined us a moment later, bourbon in hand. He looked unusually energized. The way people look when they're standing close to money they hope might become theirs. Derek says Vance is practically ready to sign, Dad said. That's good. It would be more than good. He lowered his voice slightly. $40 million. As if I hadn't heard the number 3 times already. A logistics contract, several years. Multiple facilities. Enough commission potential to keep Derek talking about it until retirement. Dad glanced toward the crowd surrounding my brother. You should let him have tonight. I looked at him. I'm standing next to an ice sculpture, drinking warm, sparkling water. I know. Then what exactly am I taking from him? Dad hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, because he knew how it sounded. Mom stepped in before the silence could grow. Your brother works very hard. I nodded. So do a lot of people. Neither of them seemed to enjoy that response. For a few seconds, we watched Derek work the room. He was good at it. I could admit that. He remembered names, maintained eye contact, made people feel important. The problem wasn't his talent. The problem was that he believed talent made him an expert in everything. A salesman who spent enough time around soldiers eventually started thinking he was one. A consultant who read enough reports started thinking they had written them. And executives who funded wars sometimes convinced themselves they understood them. The ballroom was full of people wearing borrowed expertise. I wasn't. That apparently made me the strange one. Mom adjusted the front of my jacket again. Then her eyes settled on the decorations pinned to my chest, the bronze star, the ribbons, the insignia. Her expression tightened slightly. Why did you have to wear all those heavy metal things? I blinked. What? She leaned closer. It looks so aggressive. Aggressive. I looked down. The medals weren't decorations to me. Each one represented paperwork, evaluations, deployments, years of work, decisions made under pressure, and people whose names I still remembered. But explaining that would be like explaining gravity to someone determined to believe things floated upward. They're authorized commendations, I said. Mom gave a small shrug. Still. That word again. Still. No matter what came before it, that word erased everything. I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped, because Derek had finally noticed us. I watched his expression shift from casual confidence to calculated opportunity. Richard Vance was still beside him, and now they were heading directly toward us. Derek adjusted the front of his tuxedo while walking, a performer stepping onto a stage. Several nearby executives subtly turned their attention in our direction. The CEO was moving. People noticed when power changed locations. My father immediately straightened his posture. My mother lowered her champagne glass. I could practically hear everyone preparing their best version of themselves. Meanwhile, I stood beside a melting ice sculpture shaped like an eagle and wondered whether anyone in the room realized how ridiculous they looked. The sculpture had probably cost more than the monthly salary of the hotel employee who polished the ballroom floor. The eagle's left wing was already beginning to drip. Nobody seemed concerned. Derek arrived first. Richard Vance followed half a step behind. The CEO's eyes moved across my father, then my mother, and finally settled on me. For a brief moment, his attention paused on the rows of ribbons above my pocket. Then on the medal pinned just above them. The noise around us continued, the music continued, the conversations continued. But something about Derek's grin told me he had already decided what he was about to do. And judging by the excitement in his eyes, he thought it was going to be very funny. The excitement in Derek's eyes usually meant somebody else was about to become a prop. Tonight, it happened to be me. He stopped beside Richard Vance and spread one arm toward our parents like a game show host introducing contestants. Richard, you've already met my parents. Vance nodded politely. My father Martin, my mother Sylvia. Another round of handshakes followed. Then Derek turned toward me. And this is my little sister, Valerie. Little sister. I was 34 years old. Some habits never died. Vance gave me a courteous nod. Pleasure to meet you. You too. Before the conversation could settle into anything normal, Derek jumped back in. He always feared silence. Silence gave other people a chance to speak. We were actually just talking about strategic mobility challenges, he said. Of course we weren't. Nobody had been talking about strategic mobility challenges, but Derek rarely let reality slow down a good performance. Vance seemed interested. Really? Derek smiled. That was all the encouragement he needed. The next several minutes felt like watching someone steal furniture from your house while insisting it belonged to them. He launched into a polished explanation of battlefield logistics, operational readiness, and tactical deployment structures. Every sentence sounded impressive. Every sentence sounded familiar. Because I had heard most of it before, from myself, years ago, back when Derek occasionally visited my townhouse in Alexandria and pretended to care about my work. I remembered one particular night, a Wednesday. Takeout containers from a Thai restaurant sitting on my kitchen counter, a stack of classified briefing binders locked away in my office. Derek had asked questions for nearly 2 hours while I cooked dinner. At the time, I thought he was genuinely curious. I should have known better. He wasn't collecting knowledge. He was collecting material. Now he was recycling it. Modern conflict depends on rapid force projection, he told Vance. I nearly laughed. That exact phrase had come out of my mouth while stirring a pot of curry. A phrase Derek couldn't even define back then. Now he delivered it like scripture. Vance listened carefully. Several nearby executives drifted closer. The audience was growing, naturally. Derek loved an audience. The challenge isn't equipment, Derek continued. The challenge is positioning assets before a threat evolves. Another line, another theft. I remembered drawing deployment diagrams on a paper napkin while Derek watched from across my kitchen table. He had spent most of that evening scrolling through his phone. Apparently, he had been paying more attention than I realized. Exactly, one executive said. Derek nodded confidently, as if he had personally invented military planning. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, still warm, still disappointing, kind of like this conversation. The ballroom lights reflect off crystal chandeliers overhead. Derek pointed toward the ceiling while explaining layered operational support structures. If somebody walked in at that moment, they would have assumed he had spent years inside combat zones. Maybe commanded troops, maybe coordinated missions, maybe worn a uniform himself. The truth was much less dramatic. The closest Derek had ever come to a battlefield was an airport lounge near a military conference. Yet there he stood, explaining war, a salesman describing experiences that belonged to other people. I had seen this before. Not just from Derek, from politicians, consultants, corporate advisors, people who borrowed sacrifice because it looked good in presentations. The difference was that Derek was family, but somehow made it worse. You know, Derek said, lowering his voice slightly, understanding battlefield realities gives us a unique advantage when designing solutions. Designing solutions. There was another favorite phrase. Nobody ever sold products anymore. They sold solutions. As if armored vehicles appeared through philosophy. Vance looked impressed. A few executives nodded along. One even pulled out his phone and started taking notes. I wondered if he realized his notes came from conversations that had happened years earlier in my kitchen while Derek picked at leftover spring rolls. Probably not. People rarely ask where confidence comes from. They assume confidence is proof. That's how people like Derek survive. 3 detailed observations, 1 convincing smile. Then the room fills in the rest. I watched him continue, explaining armored vehicle deployment patterns, predictive logistics, strategic sustainment. The terminology rolled off his tongue effortlessly. The problem was that none of it belonged to him, not the experience. Not the knowledge, not the scars that created the knowledge, just the words. Only the words. And words were cheap. The room didn't know that. So the performance continued. My mother looked proud. My father looked impressed. Richard Vance looked increasingly convinced that Derek was some kind of operational genius trapped inside a corporate office. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then again, Vance was smart enough to run a billion-dollar company. If he wanted to mistake confidence for competence, that wasn't my problem. Across the ballroom, servers navigated between clusters of guests carrying trays of miniature crab cakes and glasses of champagne. A waiter nearly collided with an executive who was too busy praising Derek to watch where he was walking. The executive apologized. The waiter apologized too. Only one of them needed to. Funny how hierarchy worked. Derek finally slowed down. Not because he ran out of material. Because he sensed he had achieved maximum effect. A salesman always knew when to stop talking. Any longer and people might start asking questions. Vance nodded appreciatively. That's an impressive perspective. Derek smiled. Comes with understanding the realities of modern warfare. I stared into my glass. The remaining ice shifted quietly. Modern warfare. Right, the man had never spent 18 consecutive hours staring at drone feeds searching for a safe extraction route. He had never listened to soldiers over a damaged radio connection. Never watched casualty reports arrive one name at a time. Never carried those names home afterward. Yet somehow he spoke about warfare like he owned stock in it. Maybe that was the real difference between us. For Derek, war was a market. For me, it was people. Richard Vance seemed ready to say something else. Instead, his attention drifted downward. His eyes settled on my dark blue uniform. Then on the rows of ribbons above my pocket. Then on the metal pin just above them. The ice in my glass clinked softly, and judging by the look that suddenly appeared on Derek's face, he had already decided exactly what he wanted to say next. The expression on Derek's face reminded me of a man reaching for a microphone. He had already won the room. Now he wanted applause. Richard Vance was still looking at my uniform. Not with admiration, not with suspicion, just curiosity. That was enough. Derek immediately saw an opportunity. He stepped slightly closer to his CEO and casually gestured toward me. This is my little sister, Richard. There it was again. Little sister. Not Major Valerie Thorne, not an army officer, not a professional with 15 years of service, just little sister. She does logistics paperwork down at Fort Belvoir. Several people nearby nodded politely. The statement wasn't technically false. That's what made it useful. Tactical intelligence officers completed paperwork. Pilots completed paperwork. Surgeons completed paperwork. Generals completed paperwork. Paperwork wasn't the truth. It was the disguise wrapped around the truth. Derek understood that better than anyone. Vance glanced at me. Fort Belvoir? I nodded. Part of my assignment history. That should have ended the conversation. It didn't. Because Derek wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in contrast. Every salesman needs a comparison product. Tonight, I was apparently the comparison product. He laughed lightly and took a sip of his drink. You know how it is. Vance smiled politely. Derek continued. My sister always liked looking the part. A few executives chuckled. Not because the joke was funny, because Derek had told it. Big difference. I watched the reaction spread through the small circle around us. People adjusted their smiles based on Derek's confidence level. Human nature was fascinating. The more expensive the tuxedo, the more likely somebody was to laugh before understanding the joke. Derek pointed casually toward the ribbons on my chest. She's got more decorations than half the Pentagon. Another round of laughter. Mom smiled nervously. Dad looked uncertain. Vance remained silent. Derek mistook silence for permission. That was his second mistake of the night. He leaned slightly closer toward his CEO. Then he pointed directly at the bronze star above my pocket. The small bronze medal reflected the ballroom lights. A tiny scratch ran across the lower edge near the ribbon mount. I knew exactly where it came from. The medal had spent years inside a storage case that traveled through 4 duty stations and 9 different apartments. Real things accumulated where fake things stayed perfect. Derek, of course, had no idea. He smirked. I think she bought half of those replicas online just to look tough for the contractors tonight. The laughter came faster this time, louder. The neighboring cocktail tables were listening now. I could feel attention shifting. People loved public embarrassment, especially when it wasn't happening to them. Derek turned toward me. Tell them, Val. His grin widened. Did you get the fake uniform on discount? A few executives laughed openly. One nearly choked on his drink. Another shook his head as if Derek had just delivered the line of the evening. The string quartet continued playing in the distance. Champagne glasses clinked. Conversations slowed around us. The joke was spreading, a ripple moving across polished hardwood floors. I looked at Derek, then at the medal, then back at Derek. For a brief second, I wondered if he genuinely believed what he was saying. Not the fake uniform part, the bigger lie, the belief that humiliating somebody else made him taller. Some people spent their entire lives chasing that illusion. The problem was that it never lasted. You always needed another target, another audience, another joke, another person standing below you. Eventually you ran out of people, then gravity handled the rest. I didn't say any of that. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the medal. I didn't mention deployments, or casualty reports, or evacuation routes, or the reasons that small bronze decoration existed in the first place. None of it would have mattered. People who wanted truth usually asked for it. Nobody here was asking. My mother laughed, a short, nervous laugh. The kind people use when they aren't sure whether they're supposed to join in. My father followed half a second later. His sounded more genuine, not cruel, just eager to stay aligned with the winning side. That was worse somehow. An executive near Vance smiled and whispered something to another guest. Both of them looked directly at me. Then at the medal, then back at Derek, a paperwork clerk playing soldier. That was the story now. Simple stories always traveled faster. I took another sip of sparkling water. The ice had nearly melted. Across the ballroom, a waiter replaced an empty tray, with a fresh one carrying miniature crab cakes and smoked salmon canapés. A woman near the bar laughed loudly at something she hadn't fully heard. The room continued moving. Business continued. Money continued. And, right in the middle of it, my brother stood there, waiting for a reaction. He wanted embarrassment. Anger would have worked too. Even a denial. Anything that would keep the spotlight focused on him. Instead, I gave him nothing that seemed to confuse him. His smile hesitated, only for a second. But I noticed. Years in intelligence taught you to notice tiny changes. A twitch, a pause, a shift in breathing. People revealed themselves in fractions of seconds. Derek wasn't expecting silence. He was expecting a fight. The same way a magician expects applause after a trick. I simply looked down. His shoes were polished black Italian leather. Probably custom. Probably expensive. Probably purchased with a commission larger than most people's annual salary. The ballroom lights reflected off the leather. Perfect. Flawless. Untouched by reality. My eyes stayed there, not because I was intimidated, because I was listening. The room still sounded normal. Music. Laughter. Glassware conversations, but something else had entered the background. A subtle shift, the kind you feel before you understand it. Years ago, during intelligence briefings, there were moments when an operations center would suddenly go quiet. Not silent, different. Everyone sensed something before they knew what it was. I felt that same sensation now. A disturbance moving through the ballroom from somewhere beyond our little circle. The hairs on the back of my neck rose slightly. I kept staring at Derek's polished shoes, and waited for the ambient noise in the room to suddenly drop to absolute zero. The sensation grew stronger, not louder, quieter. That's what made it different. People think important moments arrive with noise. Most of the time, they arrive by taking noise away. I was still looking at Derek's polished shoes when the string quartet stopped. Not at the end of a piece, not during a pause, right in the middle of a measure. 1 second violins were playing. The next second they weren't. The silences landed oddly, like a missing stare. Several conversations continued for another heartbeat before people noticed. Then those disappeared too. A glass touched a table somewhere behind me. A chair shifted. Then nothing. Absolute silence. 400 people in a ballroom, silent. I slowly lifted my eyes. The change was moving through the room from the main entrance like a pressure wave. People nearest the doors had already turned. The guests farther away were turning now. Heads pivoted. Conversations died. Waiters froze beside serving stations. Even the bartenders stopped moving. Nobody had announced anything. Nobody needed to. Certain people carried their own announcements. I turned toward the entrance. The ballroom doors stood open. 3 figures entered. The man in the center didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. Every step was measured, deliberate, confident. The kind of confidence that came from decades of being the highest-ranking person in almost every room. General Marcus Sterling, 4 stars, United States Army, commander of CENTCOM. Even people who had never served recognized him. His photograph appeared in enough newspapers and defense publications to make that inevitable. Two kids followed several steps behind. Neither said a word. Neither needed to. The general's presence handled communication just fine. His dress uniform was immaculate. Not flashy. Not theatrical. Everything exactly where it belonged. Years ago, one of my instructors had described command presence during a leadership seminar. You know it when you see it. That was the entire lesson. Looking at General Sterling, I finally understood what the instructor meant. The sea of guests parted automatically. Nobody was told to move. They simply did. Millionaires, executives, lobbyists, investors. People accustomed to being important suddenly became very interested in getting out of his way. Interesting how quickly status recalibrated itself. Money mattered. Rank mattered too. Sometimes one mattered more. Tonight happened to be one of those nights. Across the room, Derek saw him. I watched the transformation happen in real time. His embarrassment from a few moments ago vanished instantly. The joke, the laughter, the attention, gone, replaced by opportunity. His eyes lit up the same way they did whenever a major contract entered the conversation. Predatory, focused, hungry. The general wasn't a person anymore, he was leverage. The $40 million logistics contract suddenly had a face. And that face was walking through the ballroom. Richard Vance noticed him at the same moment. Several executives immediately adjusted their jackets. One smoothed his tie. Another straightened his posture. The entire room looked like students who had just noticed the principal enter the classroom. Derek was already moving. Of course he was. Patience had never been one of his strengths. He handed his drink to a nearby server without looking. The server nearly dropped it, trying to keep up. Then Derek started toward the general, fast enough to be eager, slow enough to appear professional. The man had rehearsed networking his entire adult life. I almost admired the commitment. Almost. My father saw what was happening and visibly brightened. "That's him," he whispered, as if anyone in the room needed clarification. My mother adjusted her necklace. Again, a nervous habit. The same one she'd had since I was a teenager. Whenever she wanted somebody's approval, her hand found her necklace. Some habits never changed. Meanwhile, General Sterling continued forward, steady pace. Unhurried, completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. His gray eyes moved across the room, observing, assessing, not searching for admiration. Searching for something else. The distinction mattered. Derek closed the distance quickly. Within seconds, he was directly in the general's path. Perfect positioning. Exactly where he wanted to be. I could practically hear his sales presentation loading. The handshake came first. Naturally, Derek extended his arm confidently. Smile prepared. Posture perfect. Voice ready. "General Sterling, I'm Derek Thorne from Ironcrest Defense." The sentence never finished. Because something unexpected happened. General Sterling didn't take the hand, he didn't even look at it, not for a second. The outstretched arm remained hanging awkwardly in the air. Derek blinked, confused. Nobody ignored Derek, especially not in public. Yet, that was exactly what was happening. The general walked forward without slowing, without acknowledging the introduction, without acknowledging the hand, without acknowledging Derek at all. A faint crease appeared between my brother's eyebrows. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. The feeling seemed unfamiliar. Richard Vance noticed it too. Several nearby executives exchanged glances. The atmosphere shifted again. Not dramatically, subtly, like a compass needle changing direction. General Sterling's attention moved past Derek, past Vance, past the investors, past the executives, past the expensive tuxedos, past the crystal chandeliers, past the money, past the performance. His eyes continued across the ballroom, then stopped, locked, focused, directly on the woman standing beside the melting ice sculpture. Me, the eagle's left wing, dripped another stream of water onto the collection tray beneath it. Nobody noticed, because at that moment, every eye in the room was following the exact same line of sight. And General Mars was walking straight toward me. The distance between us wasn't more than 30 feet. Yet somehow it felt much longer. General Sterling continued walking, straight line, no hesitation, no deviation. The crowd opened ahead of him naturally, leaving a clear path across the ballroom floor, and every step seemed to make Derek more uncomfortable. At first he looked confused, then concerned, then alarmed, because the general wasn't slowing down, and he wasn't looking at anyone else, including the CEO of a major defense contractor standing 5 feet away. Richard Vance noticed it too. The confident smile he'd worn all evening had disappeared. His eyes tracked the general's movement with growing curiosity. The room was watching, everyone, the investors, the executives, the waiters, the bartenders, even the musicians. 400 people holding their breath at the same time. It's a strange sound, almost no sound at all. Derek recovered first, or at least he tried to. He stepped sideways and moved directly back into the general's path. A little faster this time, a little less polished. The desperation was beginning to show. General Sterling, he said again, forcing a smile. Derek Thorne, Ironcrest Defense Systems, it's an honor. Still nothing, no response, no acknowledgement. The general continued forward. Derek's smile tightened. I could practically see him recalculating. This wasn't part of the script. Successful people spend years building expectations about how other people should react to them. Sometimes reality refuses to cooperate. Derek tried again. He glanced over his shoulder toward me, then back at the general. A quick decision flashed across his face, and suddenly I became useful again. Oh, he laughed nervously. My sister's kind of standing in the way. A few nearby executives shifted uncomfortably. Nobody laughed this time. Derek kept talking, the way drowning people keep kicking. Sorry about that, sir. He motioned vaguely in my direction. I'll move her. The words hung in the air. Move her. Interesting choice. I didn't move. General Sterling didn't move either. He simply stopped. The entire ballroom froze with him. For the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at Derek. Not angrily, not aggressively, just directly. The effect was worse. Years earlier, during a briefing at Fort Bragg, I'd watched a colonel silence an entire operations center without raising his voice. General Sterling's look carried that same energy, the kind that made explanations suddenly feel unnecessary. Derek stopped talking, mid-thought, mid-sentence, mid-performance. The general's gray eyes rested on him for perhaps 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Long enough. The expression wasn't hostile. If anything, it seemed mildly puzzled, like he was trying to understand why a coat rack had wandered into a hallway. Derek slowly stepped aside. Nobody told him to. He just did. The room exhaled collectively. General Sterling resumed walking toward me. I could hear every footstep now. The ballroom had become so quiet that the sound echoed faintly across the hardwood floor. I set my glass on a nearby cocktail table. The remaining ice shifted once against the side, then settled. My heartbeat remained steady, not because I was calm, because military training teaches you something useful. When a moment finally arrives, there's no benefit in panicking. The moment arrives anyway. General Sterling stopped directly in front of me, close enough for me to see the fine lines around his eyes, close enough to notice a faint scar near his jawline, close enough to recognize him not as a public figure, as a soldier. The ballroom disappeared, not physically, mentally. Everything narrowed, the noise, the people, the chandeliers, gone. Just 2 uniforms standing across from each other. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then something happened that nobody in the room expected, including Derek, including my parents, including Richard Vance. General Sterling did not offer his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't ask a question. Instead, he took half a step backward. The movement was small, precise, deliberate. Every military veteran in the room recognized it instantly. A few of them visibly straightened, because they knew exactly what came next. The general snapped his heels together. The sound cracked through the silence. Then he raised his right hand, slowly, perfectly, a textbook salute. Not casual, not symbolic, not friendly, official, respectful. Sharp enough to cut glass. A 4-star general of the United States Army stood in the middle of a ballroom filled with executives, investors, and millionaires, and saluted me. For half a second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody understood what they were seeing. I did. Training took over before thought could. My heels came together automatically. My hand rose, every angle correct, every movement precise, years of repetition compressed into a single response. I returned the salute. The ballroom remained silent. General Sterling held the salute. So did I. A second passed, then another. Then the general lowered his hand. I lowered mine. Still silence. Absolute silence. The kind that only appears when reality suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Derek. His arm was still partially extended from his failed introduction. Slowly, awkwardly, he lowered it back to his side. The movement looked painfully small. Richard Vance stared at him, then stared at me, then looked back at the general, trying to assemble facts that no longer fit together. My mother's smile disappeared completely, not faded, disappeared. As though someone had switched off a light. My father looked equally lost. The story they had believed all evening was collapsing, and the collapse had only just begun. Because General Sterling hadn't said a single word yet, and somehow that made the silence worse. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed willing to risk becoming the first person to speak. The general lowered his hand completely and looked at me for another moment. There was no smile, no dramatic expression, just recognition, the kind shared between people who had been present for the same event and never needed to discuss it afterward. Then he turned, slowly, toward Derek, toward Richard Vance, toward the circle of executives who had been laughing only minutes earlier. The shift in attention felt physical, like a spotlight moving across a stage. Derek straightened immediately, trying to recover, trying to regain control, trying to convince himself this situation still belonged to him. It didn't. General Sterling's eyes settled briefly on Richard Vance, then on Derek, then lower, to the medal pinned above my pocket. The exact medal Derek had called fake. The Bronze Star with Valor. The room remained silent. The general raised one hand, not dramatically, just enough to indicate the medal. Do you see that decoration? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. 400 people listened anyway. Nobody answered. General Sterling continued. I do. Another pause. Small, controlled, dangerous. I remember the coordinates. The room somehow became even quieter. I remember the extraction zone. His eyes never left the metal. Korangal Valley. April 2018. A muscle twitched in Derek's jaw. The general continued. The original extraction route collapsed after repeated mortar impacts. No one interrupted. No one would have dared. Several executives exchanged confused looks. The military veterans in the room looked suddenly very interested, because they understood what those words meant. Extraction routes don't collapse on PowerPoint slides. They collapse when people are trying to survive. General Sterling's voice remained steady. There were 14 soldiers trapped beyond the damaged corridor. 14. The number landed heavily. I remembered every one of them. Some memory fade. Certain numbers don't. The general continued. Communications were intermittent. Visibility was poor. The evacuation's window was closing. 3 statements, measured, precise. Then the 4th, short, sharp. People were running out of time. The ballroom remained frozen. Richard Vance slowly lowered his drink. Nobody noticed. Everyone was watching the general. Everyone except me. I was watching Derek. His confidence had vanished. Not gradually, instantly, like somebody had pulled a plug. The color was draining from his face one shade at a time. General Sterling pointed again, directly at the Bronze Star. There was a tactical intelligence officer assigned to that operation. My mother looked at me, then at the general, then back at me. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain about what she knew. An unfamiliar experience for her. The general continued. That officer stayed behind after the extraction route became unusable. Another pause. She coordinated a blind evacuation path using fragmented reconnaissance data, damaged communications equipment, and incomplete terrain reports. Several people frowned. trying to process the information, trying to translate military reality into something they understood. The general made no effort to simplify it. Good. Reality rarely arrives simplified. Mortar rounds were still impacting the area. He looked directly at Richard Vance. Then at Derek, repeatedly. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. General Sterling finally turned slightly toward me. Only slightly, as though the facts themselves were doing the talking now. 14 soldiers made it home alive. The silence afterward felt endless. Not because the statement was loud, because it was complete. Nothing needed to be added. 14 alive, everything else was details. Richard Vance stared at me, then at the medal, then back at Derek. His expression had changed completely. A few minutes earlier, he had been evaluating me as the awkward younger sister in a dress uniform. Now he was evaluating something else, his employee, the man who had mocked that uniform. The realization wasn't pleasant. You could see it happening. General Sterling finally looked directly at Derek, not angry, disappointed, much worse. His eyes traveled slowly from Derek's polished shoes upward, past the tuxedo, past the expensive watch, past the corporate confidence that had completely evaporated. Then he spoke. You stand in air-conditioned rooms selling armor you've never worn. The sentence landed like a hammer. Nobody laughed. Nobody even blinked. The general continued. She bled through hers to keep my soldiers breathing. Done. No shouting, no speech, no lecture. Just facts. The cruel thing about facts is that they don't negotiate. Derek looked as though somebody had struck him. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He tried again. Still nothing. For the first time in my life, my brother had run out of words. Richard Vance physically stepped away from him, once in step, small, visible, devastating. Nobody in the ballroom missed it. Not one person. The distance wasn't large. The meaning was. An executive near Vance quietly lowered his eyes. Another turned away completely. A third suddenly became fascinated by his drink. The social gravity had shifted, hard, fast, permanent. I watched Richard Vance study Derek as if seeing him for the first time. Not the salesman, not the rising executive, not the closer of major contracts. Just a man who had publicly ridiculed a decorated officer in front of a 4-star general. A man who had mocked a medal he didn't understand. A man who had mistaken arrogance for intelligence. The calculation happening behind Vance's eyes was obvious. Corporate leaders evaluate risk for a living. And standing beside Derek suddenly looked very risky. Nobody mentioned the $40 million contract. Nobody had to. Sometimes you can actually hear an opportunity die. Not literally, but close enough. The polished hardwood floor beneath us remained spotless. The chandeliers continued glowing overhead. The investors remained standing exactly where they were. Yet everyone in the room understood the same thing. The contract Derek had spent months chasing had just collapsed. Not because of me. Not because of General Sterling. Because of Derek. His own words had done it. His own arrogance had done it. And judging by the look on Richard Vance's face, the consequences were only beginning. The consequences were only beginning. But for the first time all evening, they no longer belonged to me. Nobody spoke for several seconds after General Sterling finished. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was honest. An entire ballroom had just watched two versions of reality collide. Only one survived. Derek stood frozen where he was. My mouth opened once. Closed. Opened again. Nothing. No clever comeback. No sales pitch. No joke. No explanation. The man who could talk for 20 minutes about strategic mobility without taking a breath suddenly couldn't produce a complete sentence. Strange how that worked. Truth occupied a lot of space. Richard Vance remained a few steps away from him. That distance never changed. Nobody noticed Derek anymore. Not really. A few minutes earlier, he had been the center of attention. Now conversations were happening around him rather than with him. People were looking through him. The transition was brutal. Corporate rooms move quickly. One moment you're valuable, the next moment you're a liability, and everyone pretends the change was obvious all along. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the joke. The fake uniform. The medal. The laughter. The choice had been his. The consequences were his too. Richard Vance finally broke the silence. Not to Derek. To General Sterling. General, I wasn't aware. Sterling looked at him. I know. That was the entire exchange. No accusation, no argument, no need. The damage was already done. Vance nodded once, then looked at me. The expression wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration either. It was recognition, the kind that arrives late, but arrives anyway. Across the room, conversations were beginning to restart in cautious whispers. The string quartet still hadn't resumed playing. Nobody seemed eager to be the first person making noise. My father looked exhausted, older somehow. He stared at the floor for several seconds before finally speaking. "Valerie?" His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I turned toward him. He stopped. Whatever speech he had prepared died before reaching daylight. For once, he seemed unsure which version of reality he was supposed to support. That couldn't have been easy for him. My mother stepped forward instead. Of course she did. Sylvia had always adapted faster. When Derek became successful, she became his biggest supporter. When the room turned against him, she immediately searched for safer ground. Unfortunately for her, that ground happened to be standing right in front of her. Me. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice trembled. A little. Just enough. She reached toward my sleeve. Toward the same uniform she had criticized less than an hour earlier. Toward the same medals she called aggressive. Toward the same daughter she had spent years minimizing. "Why didn't you tell us?" There it was. Not an apology. Not really. A revision. People often preferred rewriting history over confronting it. It felt cleaner. Less painful. I looked at her hand resting lightly against my sleeve. Then I gently removed it. Not angrily, not dramatically, just gently. The way you remove receipts stuck to your jacket after leaving a store. My mother froze. I think she expected forgiveness, or tears, or some emotional reunion that would allow everyone to move on comfortably. Life rarely follows movie scripts, especially families. I looked at her, then at my father, then at Derek, standing alone, silent, defeated. For years I thought moments like this would feel satisfying. They don't. Not really. The truth surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't interested in punishment. The feeling was something else. Absence. The absence of needing anything from them. Their approval, their validation, their understanding, their respect. For most of my life, I had carried those expectations around like extra weight. Heavy, necessary, permanent. At least that's what I thought. Standing there, I finally realized something. The weight had never been necessary, only familiar. There was a difference. I looked at my family, and for the first time, I understood that I didn't hate them. Hate requires attachment, investment, energy. I simply didn't need them anymore. That realization felt strangely peaceful. The medal on my chest wasn't valuable because somebody recognized it. The deployments weren't meaningful because somebody applauded them. The sacrifices weren't real because a ballroom full of strangers suddenly approved. They were real because they happened, that's all. Dignity isn't something handed across a dinner table. It isn't granted by parents. It isn't awarded by siblings. It isn't created by applause. It's built in quiet places, on difficult days, during long nights when nobody is watching, when nobody is impressed, when nobody even knows. General Sterling stepped beside me. His expression softened slightly, not much. For him, that qualified as warmth. "Need an escort to your car, Major?" A few people nearby smiled. Not because it was funny, because they understood exactly what he was offering. Not protection, respect. I nodded. "I'd appreciate that, sir." "Good." Simple professional. Done. I picked up my phone from the cocktail table. The melted ice sat abandoned inside the empty glass. The eagle sculpture beside me had lost most of its left wing. Gravity eventually collects everything, even ice. Without another word, I turned toward the ballroom doors. Nobody stopped me. Nobody knew how. The crowd separated naturally as General Sterling and I walked. The same crowd that had ignored me earlier. Funny. The heavy oak doors opened. The noise of the city drifted inside. Distant traffic. A passing siren. Life continuing normally, as it always does. The cool Washington night air touched my face the moment I stepped outside. For a second, neither of us spoke. I looked up at the city lights beyond the hotel entrance, then down at the brass buttons on my uniform. For years they had felt heavy. Heavy with expectations, heavy with explanations. Heavy with people who never bothered to understand. Tonight was different. For the first time in my life, those brass buttons felt lighter than air. And without looking back at the ballroom, I kept walking forward. The engine was running, but I hadn't put the car in gear yet. The parking garage beneath the Mayflower Hotel was quieter than the ballroom upstairs. The concrete walls reflected the low hum of fluorescent lights, and somewhere in the distance, a security cart rolled past with a faint squeak coming from one of its wheels. I sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, not thinking about General Sterling, not thinking about Derek, not even thinking about the ballroom. I was thinking about something much older. something that had been following me for years. For most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, eventually the people closest to me would see me clearly. Not admire me, not celebrate me, just see me. I thought there would be a moment when all the misunderstandings would disappear. A moment when my parents would finally understand why I chose the army. A moment when Derek would stop treating my career like a strange hobby. A moment when the people around me would realize that service and sacrifice weren't things you measured with a paycheck. I kept waiting for that moment, for years. The strange part is that many of us do the same thing, not just with family, with coworkers, friends, relationships. We keep believing that one more accomplishment will finally change somebody's opinion. One more promotion, one more degree, one more success, sacrifice, one more explanation. Then they'll understand, then they'll respect us, then everything will be different. But sitting alone in that parking garage, I realized something I probably should have understood years earlier. Some people misunderstand you. They've already decided who you are. There's a difference. My mother wasn't missing information. My father wasn't confused. Derek certainly wasn't uninformed. They simply preferred a version of me that fit neatly inside a story they already believed. Derek was the successful one. Valerie was the quiet one. Derek was impressive. Valerie worked somewhere in the background. That story was comfortable, and people rarely abandon comfortable stories voluntarily. I remembered a dinner years earlier. I had just completed a major assignment that earned recognition from senior leadership. The kind of recognition that usually changes careers. I brought a bottle of wine to my parents' house to celebrate. Before dessert arrived, the conversation had shifted back to Derek's new company car. A black Mercedes. Something with more letters in its model name than I could remember. Everyone spent 20 minutes discussing it. Nobody asked about the assignment. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. Little moments always matter. They stack up. Not because they're dramatic, because they're repetitive. That's how people slowly learn their place inside a family. One conversation at a time. I remembered another evening. Derek had spent nearly 2 hours asking questions about military operations while sitting at my kitchen table. The same information he later recycled in front of executives. Back then, I thought he respected my expertise. Now I understood what really happened. He respected its usefulness. Those aren't the same thing. The realization should have made me angry. Oddly enough, it didn't. It made me tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight longer than necessary. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The biggest mistake I made wasn't allowing other people to underestimate me. The biggest mistake was believing I could eventually convince them not to. That's a battle many people lose years fighting. Maybe you're dealing with it right now. Maybe someone at work has already decided you're not leadership material. Maybe a relative still treats you like the teenager you used to be. Maybe somebody keeps measuring your worth using standards that were never fair to begin with. And maybe you've spent years trying to prove them wrong. I understand that impulse. I really do. But here's what I learned. You can spend your entire life arguing with the version of you that exists inside someone else's head, and you'll never win. Because that version isn't built from facts. It's built from their assumptions, their insecurities, their preferences, their need to keep the world arranged in a way that makes sense to them. No amount of evidence can force somebody to see what they don't want to see. The ballroom taught me that, not because General Sterling defended me, because his arrival exposed something I had been avoiding. The people who finally respected me that night didn't suddenly discover my value. My value had been there all along. They simply couldn't ignore it anymore. That's not the same thing. And once I understood that, something inside me became lighter. Not because I felt vindicated, because I stopped needing permission. Permission to feel proud. Permission to trust my own experience. Permission to believe that my work mattered. The people who truly know your value don't require a public demonstration. And the people who require one will never be satisfied for long anyway. I sat there for another minute, watching the dashboard lights glow softly in the darkness. Then I remembered something else. The look on my son's face when she reached for my sleeve. For years, I thought that was the moment I wanted. The moment she finally saw me. The strange thing is that when it finally happened, it didn't feel important anymore. Because by then, I had already learned how to see myself. The image that stayed with me wasn't General Sterling's salute. It wasn't Derek standing speechless in the ballroom. It wasn't even the moment the room turned against him. The image that stayed with me was my mother's hand reaching for my sleeve. I thought about it during the drive home. I thought about it the next morning. And if I'm being honest, I still think about it sometimes. Because that moment taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. People often ask why family relationships hurt more than other relationships. I think the answer is simple. We expect strangers to misunderstand us. We don't expect it from people who watched us grow up. When a stranger gets you wrong, it's frustrating. When family does it, it feels personal. The difficult part is that most of the time, they aren't trying to hurt you. That realization took me years. For a long time, I viewed everything through a simple lens. Good people support you. Bad people don't. Life would be much easier if that were true. Unfortunately, people are usually more complicated than that. My mother wasn't a villain. My father wasn't a villain. Even Derek wasn't the cartoon version of a bad guy that stories sometimes create. The truth was messier. And because it was messier, it was more useful. My mother spent her entire life admiring visible success. She understood titles. She understood expensive cars. She understood large houses and impressive salaries. Those things made sense to her. Military service didn't. The army wasn't something she could easily measure. You can't park a deployment in the driveway. You can't display a difficult decision in a glass cabinet. You can't explain sacrifice with a business card. So she focused on what she understood, not because she hated me, because it was familiar. My father wasn't much different. He loved being close to successful people. He enjoyed the stories, the introductions, the feeling that came from standing near influence. Again, not evil, just human. Derek took those same instincts and built an identity around them. The problem was that eventually he started believing his own performance. That's where confidence becomes dangerous. Not when you fool other people, when you fool yourself. Looking back now, I don't think Derek woke up every morning planning to disrespect me. I think he spent years convincing himself that success worked like spotlight. If more light shines on someone else, less shines on you. So every achievement became a competition. Every conversation became a ranking system. Every relationship became a scoreboard. People who live that way rarely find peace. There's always someone richer, someone smarter, someone more accomplished. The race never ends. And that's a terrible way to spend a life. One of the most valuable lessons I learned from that night is that not every insult requires a response. That sounds simple. It's not. Most people feel an immediate need to defend themselves. I understand why. When someone attacks your reputation, your instincts tell you to fight back. Correct the record, win the argument, get even. I've done it before. Most of us have. The problem is that arguments rarely change people, especially when their opinions weren't built on facts to begin with. Think about your own life. Maybe you have a coworker who constantly underestimates you. Maybe a family member still talks down to you. Maybe someone keeps treating you like the person you used to be instead of the person you've become. You can spend years trying to convince them. Some people do. And sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. Because respect cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be negotiated. Real respect appears when people are finally willing to see reality. And sometimes they never get there. That's the hard truth. The even harder truth is that your life cannot be placed on hold while you wait. Too many people spend years seeking validation from people who aren't capable of giving it. Parents, bosses, friends, partners. The approval becomes the goal. The problem is that approval is unstable. It changes with circumstances, with moods, with opinions, with trends. Your values can't be built on something that unstable. That night in the ballroom, I didn't win because a general defended me. I didn't win because Derek lost. I didn't win because a room full of executives suddenly changed their minds. If my sense of worth depended on those things, it would still belong to other people. The real victory happened much earlier. The real victory happened the moment I stopped needing their permission to believe my life mattered. That's something nobody can take from you. Not family, not coworkers, not strangers, not critics. Nobody. And if there's one piece of advice I'd give anyone listening to this story, it's this. Stop measuring your value by the people who refuse to see it. Build a life you're proud of anyway. Do the work. Keep your standards. Protect your integrity. Let your actions speak longer than your arguments. Because eventually, you'll discover something important. The people worth having in your life won't require constant proof. And the people who do were never really evaluating you fairly in the first place. As I drove through Washington that night, another realization finally settled in. General Sterling's words had changed the room, but they weren't the reason I left feeling free. The reason was much simpler. For the first time in my life, I no longer needed my family's version of the story to be true. The longer I thought about that night, the more I realized something surprising. Most people assume this story is about a 4-star general putting an arrogant man in his place. I understand why. That's the part everyone remembers. It's dramatic, it's satisfying. It's the moment the room changes. But if that's all someone takes away from this story, I think they're missing the most important part. Because General Sterling wasn't the reason my life had value. He was simply the person who happened to recognize it publicly. There's a difference, a very important difference. Imagine for a moment that he never walked into that ballroom. Imagine the string quartet kept playing. Imagine the investors kept drinking champagne. Imagine Derek finished his jokes and everybody laughed. Imagine the evening ended without any dramatic confrontation at all. Would that have changed what happened in the Korengal Valley? No. Would it have changed the soldiers who made it home alive? No. Would it have changed the years of service? The deployments? The sacrifices? The decisions made when nobody was watching? No, none of it. The facts would have remained exactly the same, and that's the lesson I wish more people understood. Recognition does not create value. Recognition reveals value that already exists. Too many people spend years waiting for some moment of validation, a promotion, an award, a title, an apology, a compliment, a public acknowledgement, something that finally proves they mattered all along. The problem is that life doesn't always hand out those moments. Some people never receive them. Not because they lack value, because the world is imperfect. I've served with extraordinary people whose names will never appear in newspapers. I've worked alongside leaders who changed lives without receiving recognition outside their units. I've known soldiers who carried responsibilities most people couldn't imagine, then quietly returned home and went back to ordinary lives. No standing ovations, no headlines, no applause, just integrity. Sometimes that's enough. Actually, most of the time, it has to be. Because if your entire identity depends on outside recognition, you're placing your self-worth in the hands of strangers. That's a dangerous place to leave it. The older I get, the more I believe dignity works differently. Dignity is private. It exists before anyone notices it. It survives criticism. It survives misunderstanding. It survives neglect. And that's why it's so powerful. Think about your own life. Maybe you're working harder than anyone realizes. Maybe you're supporting a family, building a business, going back to school, recovering from something difficult, taking care of people who depend on you, trying to become a better version of yourself one day at a time. And maybe nobody is celebrating it. Maybe nobody sees it. Maybe the people closest to you don't fully understand what you're carrying. I've been there more than once. But don't make the mistake I made for years. Don't wait for permission to be proud of your effort. Don't wait for approval before respecting yourself. Don't wait for someone else to confirm your worth. Because some people never will, and that's okay. The people who truly matter won't require constant proof. They won't need you to perform for them. They won't need you to win every argument. They won't need you to justify every decision. The right people recognize character long before they recognize achievement. And the wrong people often miss both. That's not your responsibility to fix. One of the hardest lessons in adulthood is accepting that not everyone will understand your path. Some won't understand your goals. Some won't understand your sacrifices. Some won't understand why you keep going. Let them misunderstand. Keep moving anyway. Your life is too valuable to spend it auditioning for people who already decided they weren't buying a ticket. That realization changed everything for me. Not overnight, not dramatically, just steadily, the way real growth usually happens. Looking back now, I don't remember that ballroom as the place where my brother was humiliated. I remember it as the place where I stopped carrying expectations that were never mine to carry. That's a much better ending. And if you've stayed with me through this entire story, I hope that's the lesson you take with you. Not revenge, not embarrassment, not public victory, freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing who you are, even when other people don't. The freedom that comes from living according to your values instead of somebody else's approval. The freedom that comes from understanding that dignity is earned in quiet moments long before anyone applauds. And maybe that's the real reason stories like this matter. Because sooner or later, all of us find ourselves standing in a room where we're misunderstood. The question is whether we'll let that room decide who we are. I hope you don't. I hope you keep going. I hope you trust your work, your character, and your journey even when nobody else seems to notice. And if this story meant something to you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Every story we share is built around real-life lessons about dignity, family, resilience, self-respect, and the choices that shape who we become. We publish new stories every day at 12:30 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. Join our community, subscribe, and become part of the journey. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and never let someone else's opinion become the measure of your worth.